The motor pool smelled like cold diesel and colder dust, and Staff Sergeant Cole Hatch stood in the gray light with his thumbs hooked in his plate carrier, like a man who had already decided how the day would end. He was talking because he was always talking, and the thing he was talking about was her. Rookie. He let the words sit in the air so the others could hear it land. You stay by the truck. You hand up water. You count heads when we come back. That's it. That's the whole job. Around him, a half-circle of soldiers found something to laugh at. The easy laugh men give the loudest voice in the lot. And Hatch turned and looked at Specialist Sloan Brandt the way you look at a tool you have already decided is the wrong size. Brandt did not laugh, and she did not flinch, and she did not look down. She was small, a head shorter than the man beside her, narrow through the shoulders, the kind of build people read as harmless before they read anything else about her. She was checking the tension on her sling, one slow pass of her thumb, and her eyes, when they came up to meet his, were flat and level and entirely without heat. She said nothing at all. In her right hand, low against her thigh where Hatch could not see it, she turned a small flattened coin over once between two fingers, the way another person might breathe. The coin was worn smooth on both faces, the date on it long gone. She did not yet know that in 11 hours, the wind off a ridge nobody had a name for would try to take the only shot that mattered, and that this coin, and the woman who gave it to her, would be the only reason it didn't. Hatch held the silence a beat too long, waiting for her to fill it, and when she didn't, his jaw tightened the smallest amount, a man who had won the exchange and somehow felt he had lost it. Stay by the truck, he said again, quieter, as if repetition were proof. 200 kilometers east, on high ground that overlooked a road our people would be on by dusk. Another man was also certain of how the day would end, and he was cleaning the lens of an optic he had paid more for than his house. And he was smiling, because in his experience, the people who came down that road never knew he was there. Both of those men were wrong about the same woman. Neither of them knew it yet. If you're new here, do me one favor before this goes any further. Subscribe, because this channel lives and dies on whether you come back and drop the name of your city in the comments, so I know where in the world you're listening from right now. And stay to the end, all the way to the end, because there is a moment coming when a man who built his whole reputation on never saying this woman's name is going to key a radio and say it twice, out loud in front of everyone, and beg. You will want to be here for that. You will want to know how a number nobody believed got carried 2.5 kilometers across a dust storm and proved true. This story travels farther than you think. Let's go back to the beginning. 4 months earlier, before any of them had heard a round crack overhead in anger, Brandt grew up on flat brown country, where the wind never stopped, and the nearest neighbor was a smudge on the horizon. And she learned to shoot the way other kids learned to walk, without ceremony, because it was simply a thing the people around her did. The woman who taught her was Margaret Sorrell, who ran a long-range range off a county road, and who had, in her day, put rounds into paper at distances that made grown men go quiet and recheck the spotting scope. Margaret was old by the time Sloan found her, hands knotted, one eye gone milky, and she shot anyway, and she still beat people half her age who'd flown across the country to lose to her. She did not coach with encouragement. She coached with subtraction, taking away everything Sloan did that was wasted motion until there was nothing left but the shot. "The rifle is honest," Margaret told her once. The first thing she ever said that Sloane wrote down in her head and kept. "People aren't. People will tell you what you are all day long. The rifle won't. Trust the one that can't lie to you." And on the last day before Sloane shipped, when there was nothing left to say that they hadn't already said with 1,000 rounds downrange, Margaret pressed the flattened coin into her palm and closed her fingers over it. She'd flattened it herself as a girl, laid it on a rail line, and waited for the train, and carried it through 40 years, and a marriage, and 2 wars she'd watched on television, wishing they'd let her shoot in them. "I read wind with this before I had a meter," she said. "Toss it. Watch it fall. Feel where it wants to go. The day your fancy gear fails you, the air's still tellin' the truth. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." Sloane's file said expert, said distinguished, said a national junior title nobody in her new unit had bothered to read. The file undersold her. The file always undersells the quiet ones. That is the whole problem with files. Her first week in the unit, they ran a qualification on a range that topped out at 400 meters, which to Brant was the distance you use to warm up. She shot it clean and bored, her groups so tight, the scorer counted them twice and then called another scorer over, and Hatch watched from the line and said loudly that beginner's luck was a real thing and that paper didn't shoot back. But the unit armorer, a gray slab of a man named Aldous Crane, who had handed rifles to 2 decades of soldiers and learned to read people by how they held the things, did not say anything. He watched Brant clean her weapon afterward, watched the order of it, the way she logged her data in a worn notebook with a column for something he didn't recognize, watched her dry fire once against a far fence post, and read the fall of a tossed coin before she packed up. Crane had seen a lot of shooters. He had seen maybe 3 who moved like that. He didn't know what she was. He knew she was something, and he kept that to himself, and he found reasons after that to be near the line when she was on it. Tessa Roan got the same treatment Brant did, only louder, because Tessa was younger and talked back. Tessa wanted to spot, had trained to spot, could call wind and range and corrections in a clean, fast patter that should have made her valuable. And Hatch put her on water and ammo runs and told her in front of the section that her job was to be useful, which everyone understood to mean stay small and stay quiet. Tessa was neither of those things by nature, and it cost her. And one evening she found Brant sitting alone behind the maintenance bay, disassembling and reassembling a bolt in the dark by feel. And Tessa watched her hands move without light and said, "How do you do that without seeing it?" Brant said, "I'm not seeing it. I'm remembering it." And something in the answer made Tessa sit down. They became a pair, the way 2 competent people do when everyone around them has decided neither of them counts. Tessa would call a distant target, a fence post, a glint on a far hill, and Brant would tell her the dope before Tessa finished ranging it, and Tessa would check her gear and find Brant right every time, and the not knowing how of it stopped bothering her and turned into something better. "You're not normal," Tessa told her once, grinning. Brant almost smiled. "Margaret wasn't either," she said. It was the most she had volunteered about herself since arriving. Tessa filed it away. She had started to suspect that the section had it exactly backward, that the loudest gun in the lot was not the most dangerous one, and she was right, and she did not yet know how completely she was about to be proven right. The night before it happened, there was a briefing in a plywood room, and Hatch ran it because Captain Calderon let him. The way Calderon let Hatch run most things, because Hatch was loud and confident and made the job feel handled. And a tired commander will trade a great deal for the feeling that something is handled. Calderon saw Brant sidelined at the back, saw Tessa parked on logistics, saw the section organized entirely around one man's certainty, and he noticed it the way you notice a draft in a room, an awareness without action. He told himself it was fine. He told himself Hatch knew his people. He had left a door shut for months, and he had told himself the whole time that it was locked for a good reason, and tomorrow that door was going to come off its hinges, and he was going to have to look at what he'd kept behind it. The crisis did not knock. It arrived all at once, the way they do. A supply convoy, 3 vehicles long, took the road east at first light, the same road the man on the high ground had been waiting on. And at a bend, where the shoulder fell away into a dry wash, the lead truck's front end disappeared into orange light, and a sound that arrived a half-second after the truck stopped being a truck. Then the air filled with the flat hammering of machine gun fire from elevated ground, rounds walking down the stalled column, glass coming apart, men screaming the specific way men scream when the thing they trained for is suddenly real and very loud and has their range. The section had been a half-kilometer back as Overwatch. In 90 seconds, it was a firefight, and in 2 minutes, it was a slaughter that hadn't decided yet which way it would go. And the radio net was a tangle of voices stepping on each other. And Hatch, on the high shoulder, with the section's designated rifle, was firing and missing and firing and missing. Because the wind was up, and the range was long, and the targets were tucked into a rock seam at the top of a slope 700 meters off, and he could not find them. Calderon was beside him, and Calderon could see the column dying, and he could see Hatch's rounds kicking dust short and wide. And there was a moment, a real one, where the captain understood with total clarity that the man he had trusted could not make this shot, and that the soldier he had ignored for 4 months almost certainly could. It cost him something to turn his head. It cost him more to say it. "Brant," his voice came out rough, "on the gun. Now. Hatch, give her the position." Hatch's face did a complicated thing. Fury and disbelief and, underneath, a flash of something that might have been relief. And for 1 second, it looked like he would refuse. Then a round cracked off the rock beside his boot, and the second truck caught fire, and he rolled off the rifle without a word, which was its own kind of confession. Brant was already moving. She had been moving since the first explosion, low and fast, and she settled in behind the optic and put her cheek to the stock and went still in a way that made the noise around her seem to recede. Her first transmission cut through the panicked, net flat and clear and almost gentle, and every man who heard it felt the temperature of the fight change. "All stations, this is Brant. I have the high seam. Stop firing into it. You're spotting them for me. Roan, on me." That was it. No fear in it. The rookie they'd told to stay by the truck was on the net telling the whole convoy what to do, and she was doing it in the voice of someone reading a grocery list. And the men who'd laughed in the motor pool that morning would remember that voice for the rest of their lives. Tessa appeared at her shoulder, out of nowhere, lacing already, breathing fast. 740 to the seam, Winds left to right, gusting. I make it 12. Brant tossed the coin without seeming to, watched it fall, felt the air on the back of her neck. 8 at the seam, 14 at the crest. It's stacking, she said. Trust me, not the meter. She dialed, exhaled, and the rifle spoke, a deep, flat crack that rolled across the wash, different from Hatch's misses, the way a struck bell is different from a dropped pan, and 740 meters away, a muzzle that had been hammering the column stopped hammering. Hit, Tessa breathed. 1. The machine gun went quiet. The whole column seemed to inhale. She did not get to enjoy it. A second gun opened from 40 meters left of the first, and the man on it was smarter, firing in short bursts and shifting, and the rounds started coming back at the high shoulder, at her, walking in. Displace, displace, Tessa said. But Brant had already read the impacts and knew she had 4 seconds of work before the next burst found her, and she used 3 of them. The rifle barked twice, 2 seconds apart, and the second gun stopped, and the gunner's spotter broke from cover and ran, and she let him run because he wasn't shooting, and Margot's voice was in her, plain and direct, not poetry, just a fact. Read it, then send. She read it, and she sent, and men who should have died did not. 3, Tessa said. That's 3. For the next several minutes, the fight belonged to her, and the section learned what it was watching. Targets in the rocks, targets behind a stalled fuel truck, a man with a rocket on his shoulder. She dropped before he could shoulder it, the launcher tumbling down the slope. Sound layered on sound, the deep punch of her rifle, the lighter snapping of carbines below. Rounds spanging off truck steel with a bright musical ring and slapping into the dirt berm, with a dull thud you felt in your teeth. The rotor thump of a far-off bird that wasn't coming yet, Tessa's count climbing in a flat, fast murmur. 6, 8. Then the volume of incoming fell off, and the gaps between her shots stretched, and it began, impossibly, to look like the convoy might hold. It did not stay easy, because it never does. On her 9th shot, the rifle did the thing that turns a good day into a bad one in a quarter second. The bolt riding home on a round that wasn't seated and stopping hard. A dead click where a crack should have been. And in the same heartbeat, a fresh gun opened from a low wadi off the right flank that nobody had cleared, a position that should not have been there, walking rounds across the front of the column toward the soldiers pinned behind Truck 3. Brant did not freeze, and she did not curse. Her hands were already moving. The mortar and pestle rhythm Margot had drilled into her 10,000 times in the dark. Lock back, strip the round, slap, charge, the brass spinning away, bright against the dust, and the whole malfunction was a memory inside 2 seconds, while Tessa called the new threat. Right low, the wadi, 11 o'clock off your line. They're enfilading 3. The new gun's report was different from the others. A tighter, faster stutter that cracked off the truck's steel with a sharper ring than the heavy gun had made, and Brant heard the difference and used it, swinging onto the wadi, and the man working the flank learned that the price of a clever position is that it puts you in the open from exactly one angle, and she had that angle. 2 shots close together, and the tighter stutter quit. 9, Tessa said, voice climbing. 10. Then a round came back at them so close that Brant felt the heat of it part the air above her optic, a hand's width high, and she pressed her cheek harder to the stock and read where it had come from. In the half-second the dust hung, a spotter she'd missed feeding corrections to someone she couldn't see. And she sent into the place, the dust pointed, and the corrections stopped coming. The slope went quiet in long stretches now, broken only by the lighter snapping below and the bright musical spang of stray rounds off dead trucks and the far thump of a bird that still wasn't theirs. 12, Tessa breathed. It was beginning, against everything, to look like it might hold. Then a voice on the net said the medic was hit. Brant keyed up. Anand, this is Brant. Say status. Nothing. Static. She said it again. Anand, status. The net hissed back at her, empty. 3 long seconds of nothing, where a voice should be. And in that nothing, she heard the worst version of every outcome. A 4th second. A 5th. Then a different voice, cracking. She's down by truck 2. She's still moving, but we can't get to her. The open ground's covered. Brant looked at the stretch of road between cover and truck 2, 60 meters of nothing under fire. And she looked at it the way you look at a problem, and not the way you look at a death. And she handed Tessa the rifle and said, Keep their heads down. I'm going back for her. Tessa said, That's suicide. Brant said, Watch your sectors, and went over the berm. This is the part they tell about her, the part that put her name into the title of every story anyone ever told about that road. Everyone else who could move had pulled back to cover, the way you are trained to, the way that keeps you alive. She was the only one who went the other way. The 60 meters took 11 seconds, and they were the longest 11 seconds of her life. She felt the air move as rounds passed her, that flat displacing snap that means it was close. Felt grit kick up against her cheek, where one struck the road a hand's width from her boot. Felt her own pulse enormous in her ears, and the strange, slow clarity that comes when the body finally accepts it might not survive the next stride. She saw the medic, specialist Priya Anand, crumpled against the truck tire with one arm soaked dark and a sheet of blood coming down over her eyes from a tear in her scalp. And she saw Anand was alive because Anand was cursing. She reached her and dragged her behind the wheel, and the truck rang like a struck gong as the burst that was meant for both of them found the steel instead. You're an idiot, Anand said through her teeth, blind, both hands clamped on her own arm. Why would you do that? Brant didn't answer. Anand was the one everyone leaned on, the calm one, the one who'd taught half the company how to stop a bleed, and she was working through a problem she could not see and could feel slipping. It's the brachial, the arm. I can't see to clear my own eyes. I need you to... Tell me, Brant said. So Anand talked her through it, the medic coaching her own rescue, and the same hands that had just sent rounds across 700 meters worked the wound packing into the torn place above Anand's elbow. Slow and exact, no wasted motion. Margit's subtraction made flesh. The bleeding slowed. The bleeding stopped. Anand sagged and got quiet. And then she asked the question, small, in a voice with all the medics stripped out of it, just a person on the ground. Am I going to die out here? Brant wiped the blood out of Anand's eyes with her thumb so the woman could see her face when she answered. Not today, she said. Not on me. It wasn't a hope. It was a fact she was stating, the way she'd state a range. Anand believed her because no one could have not believed that voice. The truck above them was dead, engine gone. But Brant had grown up on machines that were always half broken, and she got Anand into the cab. and got the starter to catch on the third try by doing something to the wiring under the column that no one trained her to do. And she put the limping vehicle in gear and drove it out of the kill zone on 2 flat tires, with rounds punching through the door behind her, low in the seat, talking steadily to Anand the whole way to keep her present. She came out the far side, the only vehicle to drive itself out of that bend under its own power, and behind her, the high seam had gone silent under Tessa's careful fire, and the first crisis, which had arrived in 90 seconds, was over in something close to 11 minutes. They counted heads. They had all of them. Calderon stood in the road looking at the woman he'd told to stay back, and he could not find anything to say, and that was the moment the day cracked open for him. They thought it was finished. It was not finished. Word came that a quick reaction element on a parallel route had a casualty too critical to move by ground, a bird inbound to a landing zone on a low rise a kilometer north, and the section was nearest, and they were tasked to secure that rise and hold it until the helicopter could get the wounded man out. Simple on paper. But the man on the high ground 200 kilometers of certainty ago had not been the only patient enemy in that country. And as the section pushed north, the weather began to turn. A brown wall building on the horizon. A haboob, a wall of dust the size of a mountain range, walking toward them on a wind that swallowed the light. And somewhere out ahead of them, a single very good rifle was waiting for exactly the kind of stationary target a landing zone makes. He announced himself the way the best ones do, with 1 round. A soldier named Boone, standing too tall at the edge of the rise, simply dropped, and the crack arrived a long second later from somewhere impossibly far, from inside the leading edge of the dust, where there should not have been a shooter at all, and everyone went flat. He had them. He had the only ground that mattered, and he could see it, and they could not see him, and the bird could not land into a hot LZ, and the critical casualty had minutes, not hours, and the storm was eating the daylight, and the visibility shot by shot. This was a different animal than the morning. The morning had been volume. This was one mind, patient and trained, and it had chosen its ground first. Hatch tried. To his credit, this time he tried, for 30 full seconds before he stopped lying to himself, scanning the dust wall through his optic. And he found nothing, because there was nothing to find, because the man out there understood concealment the way Brandt understood wind. "I can't see him," Hatch said, and the admission cost him visibly, the words coming out cramped. "I can't even see where he is." Brandt was already prone, but she wasn't looking through her scope yet. She was watching the dust, watching how it moved, watching a single thread of grit lift off a far hummock differently than the grit around it, and she was tossing the coin and feeling the wind change layer by layer as the storm front loaded the air. "He fired 3 times, she said. "Same report each time. He's not moving. He found his spot before the storm, and he's married to it." Tessa, beside her, was working the problem from the other end, and Tessa was the one who solved the half of it. Brandt couldn't. "He's not where the sound says." Tessa said it fast, half to herself, the way she got when she was right. "The wall's bending the report. The sound's coming around the dust. That's why it feels like it's everywhere. Watch the daylight, not the sound." And then she did the thing that Brandt would name to the captain that night, the thing that made the impossible shot possible. She decided, on her own, against every instinct that wanted her flat in the dirt, to low crawl 40 meters to a flank, where a fold in the ground gave a sliver of angle the rest of them didn't have, and she lashed into the murk along that line until the rangefinder caught something solid in a gap. The wind tore open in the dust for half a second, a man-shaped density on a far, far ridge, and the number that came back made her stop breathing. She crawled back with grit in her teeth and put her mouth next to Brant's ear. He's on the saddle, the far one. It's not 700, Sloan. It's 2,600, give or take the storm. Brant was quiet for a moment. 2,600 meters was farther than any shot anyone in that unit had ever logged. Farther than the confirmed record any of them had ever heard a true story about. Far enough that the round would be in the air for whole seconds. Far enough that the curve of the planet and the spin of the round and the breathing of a storm all became things you had to hold in your mind at once. It was, by every honest measure, not a shot. It was a prayer with math attached. And then the radio did the thing this whole story was waiting for. The net clicked, and there was a silence on it. A long, ugly silence. 3 seconds. 4. The sound of a proud man standing at the edge of a thing he had sworn he would never do. Then Cole Hatch's voice came across, and it was not loud. Brant. A pause, like the name had a weight he had to lift. Then, because the first time wasn't enough to be real, he said it again. Brant. It's Hatch. Everyone on the net heard the next part. I can't make this shot. Nobody here can make this shot but you. There's a man on that bird who's got about 6 minutes, and the only thing standing between him and that helicopter is a rifle I can't find and a target I can't reach. He had to stop. You could hear him breathe. I'm asking you, take it. Whatever you need, you've got it. Just take the shot. On the rise, the men who had laughed 4 months ago went very still, and Calderon closed his eyes, and Tessa stared at Brant with her whole heart in her face, and the loudest gun in the lot had just gotten on the radio and begged the rookie to save them all, by name twice. Brant keyed once. Copy. Then she went away into the place where she did the only thing she had ever truly been built for. The storm front was on them now, the light going the color of a bruise. The wind no longer a single thing but a stack of competing rivers at different heights between her and the saddle. And her meter, when she checked it, gave her a number, and then gave her a different number. Useless. The air changing faster than the gear could read. So she did what Margit told her she would have to do someday. She tossed the coin one last time and watched it fall and felt the wind on her face and the back of her hand and read the truth the instruments couldn't hold. Then she found, in the gap Tessa had given her, a darker density on the far saddle, and she held. A fragment of something, frag from a round that struck the rocks near her, as the enemy started ranging back toward Tessa's old position, had opened a hot line across the back of her shooting hand, and the blood made the trigger slick, and her last magazine held 4 rounds, and the light was nearly gone, and she breathed it all out and let none of it into the rifle. She did not rush it. She waited through one gust and a second, holding the density on the saddle while seconds bled and a man's life ran out on an inbound helicopter. And Tessa beside her did not say a word, did not breathe, because she understood that the waiting was the shot. Margit's full voice came back to her then, the whole thing, the first thing she'd ever kept. The rifle is honest. Trust the one that can't lie to you. and the air was telling the truth, and she was finally quiet enough to hear it. Between the third gust and the fourth, in the half-second of agreement, in the gap in the dust, she sent. The crack rolled out and was eaten by the storm, and the round climbed into the brown sky and fell for what felt like the rest of everyone's lives. 3 full seconds across 2.5 kilometers of moving air. And on the far saddle, the density that had been a man and a rifle and a patient certainty simply came apart and was still. The empty channel that had been the enemy's whole advantage filled with nothing at all. The good kind of nothing. The bird came in. The man on it lived. Brant lowered her bleeding hand off the rifle and was, for 1 second, the only thing on that rise that did not move. The number did not survive contact with the rear. When the section came in and Tessa said it out loud, 2,600 meters, in a dust storm, with iron weather and degraded optics and a torn hand, a major from the brigade said the word that proud institutions always say, which is impossible, and then said the worse word, which is exaggerated. And for a day, it looked like the greatest shot any of them had ever seen would be filed as a rookie's tall tale. It was not the range that saved the truth. It was 3 things arriving from 3 directions that could not have agreed by accident. The drone that had been orbiting the LZ had thermal and time-stamped logs, and on the playback, you could watch the saddle source go cold in the same frame. The audio caught her report, the time of flight matching the distance to within what physics allowed, and nothing else. The quick reaction element that recovered the enemy position found his rifle, and, more damning, his own rangefinder still on his body, and the last number stored in it was the range to the rise, and it matched. And his spotter, taken alive, said through an interpreter that they had chosen the saddle precisely because no weapon they knew of could reach it, that they had laughed about it, that the shot that killed his shooter was not supposed to be able to exist. 3 independent things. 1, impossible truth. The major stopped using the word impossible and started using her name. They held the reckoning in the same plywood room, days later, and it was Hatch who stood, and he was not the man from the motor pool. Whatever had been holding his spine so straight for so long had gone out of him, and he stood in front of the section he had run on volume and certainty, and he tried to speak and could not, and started again. "I told you to stay by the truck." His voice came apart on the word truck, and he stopped and pressed his knuckles to his mouth and made himself keep going. "I told you that because—" He stopped again, the apology halting, restarting, each word visibly costing him something physical, his jaw working, his eyes wet and furious at being wet. "Because if you were small, then I got to be big. That's the whole of it. That's the ugly whole of it. There's a man alive on a helicopter, and a medic alive in a hospital, and every one of us is alive in this room, because I was wrong about you in the loudest way a man can be wrong, every single day, out loud, where everyone could hear me do it." He looked at her, and the celebrated marksman of that section, the loudest gun in the lot, said the thing that cost him the most. "You're better than me. You were always better than me. I knew it the first day on the range, and I made sure nobody else got to see it." The room didn't breathe. Brant let the silence hold a moment, the way she held everything, and then she gave him the only answer she ever gave when the world finally turned to look at her. She did not gloat, and she did not forgive him with a speech. She just turned the worn coin over once in her fingers and met his eyes and said 2 words. The same 2 words she'd say to all of them before this was over. Words that had started the morning, meaning one small thing about a woman who refused to fall, and ended meaning something much larger. Still here. That was all. Still here. And every person in that room understood that she meant it about Anand, and about the man on the bird, and about Boone who'd live, and about herself, the rookie they'd told to stay by the truck who was, against all of it, still here. Captain Calderon spoke last, and he did not speak easily. He sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the table and his head down, a man assembling the hardest sentence of his career, and when he finally looked up, his face had aged. "I want to say something, and I want it on the record." He breathed. "For 4 months, I let one man tell me who my soldiers were, because it was easier than learning it myself. I saw her pushed to the back. I saw it, and I called it handled. That door stayed shut because I left it shut. And if it had stayed shut one more day, there are people who would be dead who are not dead. And that is not Hatch's failure to carry alone. It's mine. I commanded that. I own it." He stood, and the struggle went out of his face, and something firmer came in, and he looked at Brant, and the recognition came in 5 plain words that landed harder than any metal. "Section lead, effective right now." Then quieter. "Roan, you're her spotter, and your name goes in this report at the top, because you crawled 40 meters into a gunfight to hand her a number, both of you, on the record, where everyone can read it this time." The change in Hatch was not a speech, because Brant had taught the whole room without meaning to that speeches were the cheap part. It came weeks later, on a range, in a thing he did. The brigade wanted the section's long-range record formally amended and a senior shooter to certify the new entry. And that senior shooter, by every right of seniority and reputation, should have been Hatch, whose name had sat at the top of that board for 3 years. Instead, Hatch walked into the office and requested, in writing, to be reassigned as Brant's spotter, the celebrated marksman asking to carry the gear and call the wind for the rookie. And when a master sergeant scoffed and asked if he understood he'd be giving up his own gun to do it, Hatch said yes, that was the point. That he had spent 3 years being the best shooter in a section that had a better one standing behind him holding water, and he intended to spend the rest of it making sure that never happened to anyone again. He took his own name off the top of the board himself with a paint pen and wrote hers above it, and stood looking at it for a while, and then went to find his new shooter and ask what time she wanted to be on the line. When they totaled it, formally, the number that went into the record for those 2 operations, separate entirely from the one shot that no one would ever stop talking about, was 31. 31 threats neutralized across one road and 1 rise by a soldier. Most of her own unit could not have picked out of a formation a season earlier. A whole number. Clean, confirmed, 3 ways like everything else about her had to be confirmed because she was small and quiet, and the truth about her was always too large for the people looking at her. 31. And every one of those numbers was a head that came back, which was the only count she ever actually kept. Crane the armorer found her cleaning her rifle the evening it all settled. The same ordered ritual, the same worn notebook, and he stood watching the way he had that first week, except now he let himself say the thing he'd kept to himself for 4 months. He wasn't a man of many words, and the ones he had came out rough. "I've handed rifles to a lot of soldiers," he said. "Most of them count rounds. You're the only one I ever watched who counts the people who get to go home, and counts them like they're yours." He nodded once, the highest punctuation he owned, and walked off, and Brant looked after him for a moment longer than she looked after most people. Tessa took it harder than she let on, the way the young ones do after the adrenaline leaves, and the math of how close it had been finally arrives. Brant found her sitting on the same maintenance bay step where they'd first talked, staring at nothing, and sat down beside her without a word. And after a while, Tessa said, "I keep thinking about the 40 meters. If I'd been a meter off on the lazy, if the gap in the dust had closed 1 second sooner." Her voice wobbled. "We were one coin toss from all of it going the other way." Brant was quiet, and then she did the only thing she ever let herself do, the single private warmth she allowed in a life of public stillness. She bumped her shoulder against Tessa's once and said, low, "You crawled into a gunfight and handed me the shot. There's no version of that where you were small." It was the closest thing to a hug either of them would ever give the other, and it was enough. And Tessa laughed wet and shaky, and they sat there in the dark until the shaking stopped. The thing Margaret had taught her, the lesson underneath the wind reading and the subtraction and the honest rifle, came out of Brant's mouth only once, and it came out the night Hatch asked her, plainly, why she had never once, in 4 months, said a single word to defend herself, while he ran her down in front of everyone. She thought about it for a while. "Because none of it was the argument," she said finally. "You can shout a person down. You can shout for 4 months. You can't shout down a shot that lands. The skill's not for the range, or the board, or proving anyone wrong. It just sits there quiet until the one day comes when nothing else on earth will do, and then you use it, and it makes its own argument, and there's nothing left for anybody to say." She turned the coin over once. "Margaret told me the rifle can't lie. That's the whole thing. I just had to wait for the day the rifle got to talk." And on the last evening before the section rolled out again, she walked the long way around the perimeter alone, the way she always did, and she stopped on a low rise where the wind came clean across the flats and reminded her of home, and she took out a worn-out satellite phone and got Margaret Sorrell on the line, the old woman's voice crackling across the world. She didn't tell her about the number. She didn't tell her about the man on the saddle, or the storm, or the bleeding hand. She just said the coin had worked, that the air had told the truth when nothing else could. And Margaret was quiet a moment, and then said, "Course it did. I told you. The day your gear fails, the wind's still honest. You just have to be quiet enough." Brant smiled, the small private one, and turned the flattened coin over in her fingers one last time, and tossed it, and watched it fall, and read the wind, which was fair. 200 kilometers, and a lifetime away, in the motor pool of his certainty. No man stood any more, telling anyone to stay by the truck, because the section had learned what its quietest soldier was, and the road had learned it, and the enemy who'd laughed on the saddle had learned it in the last second of his life, and even the proud institution that had nearly filed her truth as a lie had learned it. The certainty that had opened this story, the easy laugh, the man who knew exactly how the day would end, had collapsed completely and been replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous to anyone who'd ever underestimated a small woman with steady hands. Engagement window on this story is now complete. Brant stood on the rise with her level eyes on the dark horizon, breathing slow, perfectly still, the only one who came back, and the only one, it turned out, who ever needed to.